Good evening and welcome. I'm delighted to see so many of you here this evening for the Institute and Faculty's Autumn Lecture. My name is Philip Scott, and I have the privilege of being the President of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries for this year. You may ask the question, what are my Scottish credentials for chairing such a meeting in such an august location? Well, I thought I'd just give you one or two. Firstly, I do own a kilt. It is a Scott clan, ancient green in colour. My executive career, I worked for the Aviva Insurance Group, and that group, of course, included the General Accident Insurance Group and also the Scottish Union Insurance Group, for those of you who've been around as long as I have. Since retirement, I've joined the board of RBS, and amongst other things, I chair the board risk committee there. And finally, my Scottish credentials, I am on the board and I chair the audit and risk committee for the world's largest Scotch whisky company, Diageo. The Institute and Faculty has made a commitment to deliver more engaging thought leadership events for our members and our stakeholders. Part of that commitment is our undertaking to organise 2 lectures a year, one in Scotland and one in London. The overall aim is to provide useful resources for our members and the people we work with, to advance the work that we do on subjects of relevance and informed debate. This evening's lecture builds upon the success of the last 2 lectures. Dr. Martin Wheel, member of the Monetary Policy Committee, and Scotland's Chief Medical Officer, Sir Harry Burns. I'm delighted to welcome Jeremy Peat this evening. We're honoured that he has agreed to speak to us. Jeremy trained as an economist at Bristol University and University College London. Worked as an economist for various UK government departments, including HM Treasury, 8 years at the Scottish office. He's been Group Chief Economist at the Royal Bank of Scotland, is Chairman of the BBC Pension Trust, a member of the Competition Commission, and Fellow of both the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Chartered Institute of Bankers in Scotland. In 2005, he was made a Director of the David Hume Institute. The David Hume Institute aims to stimulate and influence thinking in key public policy areas. It focuses on economic issues, including the interaction between the economy and the law. The Institute and Faculty took corporate membership of the David Hume Institute earlier in the year. Jeremy is very qualified to speak to us with authority this evening. He will provide his thoughts on the longer-term expectations for our economy in the context of global and domestic changes, an attempt to think through the implications for businesses, individuals, and society. It will be very much a forward look into the future, what we should expect as we emerge from recession, and some thoughts about how things will undoubtedly change. Can I welcome Jeremy to the lectern with your help, please?
Well, thank you very much, Philip, and I'm pleased to tell you that we are related. My grandmother was a Scot, and so I think we ought to both go back and do our research as to our family background. I'm told that if you can actually uncover that you're related to Sir Walter Scott, it's all done, because then you can get every descendant. So maybe we ought to go and see where we join up in the past. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I do feel deeply honoured to be asked to deliver your annual lecture, and I must admit to being somewhat overwhelmed by the sheer quality of the audience, and it's also a huge quantity. Seeing as a lot of you are actuaries, I'm very well aware that every mathematical error that I make will be mentally corrected as we go through, and I'm sure every error of logic will be noted down and held against me. So let me try to avoid errors, but I must admit that I won't be totally successful because I'm going to cover what is really a very wide canvas in about 45 minutes. But I thought I'd just start by letting you know a little bit about my career, my journey as an economist, if you like, because I like to think that I've been through 4 stages of economic life. My first career was as a development economist. I joined the Ministry of Overseas Development and worked for them in Bangkok in the Vietnam War years, covering the whole of Southeast Asia, and then later spent 3.5 years in Botswana, which was actually an escape from the early years of Thatcher, and a wonderful time too. I like to think that as my sort of social conscious period as an economist, and it actually was longer than my period as a bank economist, which is sometimes something I want you to hold that thought, that the bank economist is what a lot of people may know I did, but development economist was longer and in many ways better. My second period as an economist was as a bumbling bureaucrat. That's the time I was in the civil service, including 11 months at the Treasury. Now that, I think, is an important, again, timeline. It's long enough to understand, but not long enough to be captured by the Treasury. I bumped into Sir Nick Macpherson last week, who was the Permanent Secretary to the Treasury, who greeted me very jovially, which surprised me because I didn't remember him at all. And he reminded me that in February 1985, he actually took over my job in the Treasury. He came in as a consultant on a short-term basis to fill in. And basically the boy done well, hasn't he? But I like to think that I gave him his start in life to propel himself through. So I spent those years at the Treasury and, very interestingly, at the Scottish Office. Then my third phase was 12 years at the Royal Bank of Scotland. 10 years very good, 2 years a bit dodgy at the end. But I got out in 2005 when I personally believe, and just look across to a board member at the moment, I personally believe at that stage it was still a highly respectable and reputable organisation. After that, I took on what I consider my sort of freewheeling phase, when I do whatever I like, which is quite a nice state of the world. And I have a liberty to wander hither and thither. The Competition Commission, 6 years on the board of the BBC, writing a column for the Herald and other pieces, on the board of Scottish Enterprise, chairman of the board of the Zoo, which I joined for fun and turned out to be traumatic. But the pandas are lovely, do come and see them and spend your money, we need it. So those 7 years I've been analysing, I've been investigating, and I suppose I've done a bit of pontificating as well. Those 4 phases have come together in developing some of the thoughts that I'm going to put before you. Now, the broad flow of this lecture will be, as far as it can be, forward-looking, as Philip said, but I think one has to have something of the past and the present in order to get the basis for that. So this is the sort of lines I'll be following. Our economy, domestically and internationally, has for many years exhibited a tendency to positive growth of output. We've grown on a regular basis, coupled with a distinct tendency to be cyclical, but with relatively short downturns, alongside longer and more substantial upturns. In the decade spanning the turn from the 20th century to the 21st century, economic performance was exceptional. This was what the Governor of the Bank of England likes to call the NICE decade. N for non-accelerating, I inflation, and C for consistent, E expansion. So inflation was under control and expansion was major, the very nice decade. Now, in part, this period of success was due to improved management of monetary policy in particular. But it was not going to be nice forever, because it was also related to massively increased credit for governments, households, and consumers. So the rate of expansion was unsustainable. Tears before bedtime were inevitable. Now, I'm not going to dwell on the banking catastrophes, as that would take a whole other lecture, but I just will note that the traumas that flowed through the banking and wider financial sector also had a major impact on domestic and global economies. They came together with the impact of excessive credit and unsustainable growth to create something of a perfect economic storm. And what followed, what we're still in, was no ordinary recession. This is different. And that is demonstrated, as I'll show, by the depth of the recession and its duration, severe compared to predecessors. Now, let me just a caveat. Recession formally is denoted by 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Recessionary period, to me, is a much longer one which covers the whole phase of the downswing before you get back to where you started. So bear with me if I use the word recession a little loosely at times. But it's still not clear when the UK is actually going to emerge from this enduring recessionary period, nor how long it will take for our economy to recover lost ground. We're by no means back to the past peak. And even when output does turn from negative to positive, and it will, our economy is going to be very different from that 10-year nice decade. Growth will have to be slower to be sustainable, and the overall context is changing. We'll face also the effects of demographic change, and they are major, and the cost, which is by no means insignificant, of reducing and containing greenhouse gas emissions. And in addition, the cost of dealing with the economic and wider social effects of this long and deep recession. We've got a lot to deal with, and there will be widespread implications for all households and all businesses. And I would just add that those of us that were born in the 40s, 50s, or even the early parts of the 60s will count ourselves lucky, I suggest, as compared to those of the generations that follow. This is going to be a very difficult period even when we get out of the hole we're in now. So I want to start off by using just a few slides to illustrate the position, and I must immediately acknowledge that the slides were provided by Professor David Bell of Stirling University. He knows I nicked them, and he knows I'm using them here, but he's got some very useful slides which I'm just using. So the first slide, if we go through it, just shows long-term trends in GDP growth. You can see that long continuing upward movement from 55 onwards, steady upward trend. And we've been accustomed to that. And there's a little downward hook at the end, which shows the recent difficult period. Now that may look minimal, but that is a far more significant downward hook than any other in the whole of that period from 55. And I mentioned that our recession was different from others. Well, this chart compares our recession with the previous periods from the 30s onwards. It's now 50 months since the recession started in 2008. We have yet to see a return to a sustained upward path, and output now is still 5% below the pre-recessionary peak. If you look at the chart, you'll see that for the normal recessions, and I'm excluding the Great Depression at the moment, for the normal recessions in the latter part of the last century, recovery was underway within 30 months. And after 50 months, output was markedly above the level at the outset of the recession. So we're deeper, we're longer. And that even compares with the Great Depression of the 1930s. In those days, recovery was underway within 3 years, and a new peak in output was attained in 45 months. So our latest downturn is markedly more enduring. This is a very severe episode. It's atypical, and the only thing I can contrast it with in my experience is the Japanese lost decade, which actually lasted very much longer than a decade. It's different from anything that we in the West have experienced in the modern era. And this different experience emerged because of different factors. It may hence require different policies, and certainly will result in different post-recession outcomes. Now, I just want to touch for a little while upon debt. The extent to which our debt across the economy has accelerated since the mid-1990s. And I want to start by making sure we distinguish properly between debt and deficit. Debt is a stock measure, and deficit obviously is a flow, showing the difference between expenditure and revenue, if you like, in any one period. Both can be shown helpfully as a percentage of GDP, and of course a continuing series of high annual deficits will, as happened in the run-up to and during this recession, that will result in a sharp increase in the total stock of debt. So what is good and bad for government debt and government deficits? Well, just one possible yardstick is the measures used, the Maastricht criteria, supposedly to limit the countries allowed to enter the Eurozone. Well, that opted for a maximum deficit in any one year of 3% and a maximum debt as a stock compared to GDP of 60%. And I'd actually just note on that Italy had a stock of debt that was about 120% of GDP, but the founding fathers wanted Italy to be a member of the Eurozone, so that excess over 60% was defined as small and temporary. Italy entered, and after that you couldn't stop Greece or anyone else coming in. And in that one political fudge, I think, was sown the inevitable seeds of the euro crisis that we're still suffering from. So at the back end of the 1990s and the early years of this century, UK government deficits tended to be low and constrained, and total public sector debt was well contained at below 40% of GDP, not 60%, 40%. But the pickup from 2008 to now has been sharp, as annual deficits rose to dramatically above 3%, and you can see in the blue line how the move from below 40 to well above 60 has taken place. That was, of course, in part related to the recession itself. And one of the key challenges for UK policymakers, and indeed for the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is their arm's length advisor, and very important it is to have them, is to distinguish between an increase in government's structural deficit, which must be constrained, contained, and reduced, and any increase in the cyclical deficit, which is in large part a natural working of economic forecasting forces. This is the natural stabilizers that Keynes always referred to. What happens is that corporate and personal tax revenues tend to rise and fall in line with the cycle, while welfare-related and some other benefits, including unemployment costs, rise and fall counter-cyclically. So the deficit, the cyclical deficit, goes up in bad times, and that should be a temporary move, because in the good times, the cyclical deficit should return to whence it came. And it is important to be sure that you're cutting structural rather than cyclical in the way you deal with fiscal policy. Now, while public sector debt rose, as you can see from this chart, primarily during the recession, corporate and household debt, if you look at it, rose steadily and substantially much earlier, from the latter part of the 1990s indeed. At the time this trend was underway for households, there was limited concern. The stock of debt was rising, it was argued, but the ratio of household debt repayments to incomes looked sustainable, even as that debt rose. That was because we had sustained low interest rates. Inflation was controlled, we'd cracked it, and low interest rates were with us forever. So in this continuing low inflation environment, a higher level of debt could readily be serviced by households. And given the low interest rates, the ratio of repayments to incomes had not really risen. So banks, given this change in the environment, adjusted their risk analysis and were more willing to finance household debt, whether it be mortgages, personal loans, credit cards, or whatever. And households became increasingly willing to take on debt, not least because of the major rise in house prices, which led to a perception of greater wealth, which for many was just temporary. But that justified to them greater debt. But clearly the trend was unsustainable, as we now know, and eventually households and businesses had to set to work to rapidly reduce debt burdens. So both household demand and corporate investment fell away very sharply, and that ratcheted down economic output. And remember, households are 2/3 of our economy. And the chart shows that for both households and corporates, the debt to GDP ratios rose from about 60% to over 100%, but the extent of the reduction since the peaks has been quite limited. We have got a long way to go to get back to previous levels and to what I would call stable equilibrium. And given that, I just note for the future that it's difficult to see how household demand, or indeed business investment, can be seen as significant sources of economic invigoration. And it's easy to understand why many businesses are still reluctant to step up their credit and their investment. So what happens next? The Sue Barker question. Well, I think the challenge ahead is to steadily return all elements of debt to more appropriate and sustainable levels, while at the same time securing an exit from recession. That's easy to say, isn't it? We've got to get debt back, but we've got to get out of recession. We've got to secure some growth of output. Now, if there is any good news around it, is that we're still in a position where the absolute scale of our stock of public sector debt is still orders of magnitude lower than in Greece, Spain, Italy. Just above 60% is nothing compared to their stock of debt to GDP ratios. And we do have the capability, we still retain that capability, to get our deficit under better control and avoid growth of the stock of debt to anything like the levels that they have achieved. And another advantage we have, or at least a perceived advantage, over those Eurozone countries that are struggling so much, is that we have a flexible exchange rate. In theory, sterling can depreciate as we struggle, and we can get more competitive, export more, reduce imports, and provide recovery through that route. So I think it may be this combination of a relatively, compared to some other countries, stock of government debt and a flexible exchange rate, which helps to explain why our credit rating has not suffered as others have. Of course, a depreciating exchange rate brings with it risks of importing inflation, but I believe we remain in a low inflation environment. It's not something that causes me angst at the moment. But I don't see how we can expect sterling to depreciate against the euro, given their troubles, and many of our key competitors and most of our markets are located within the Eurozone. And even competitive companies in Scotland, as in the rest of the UK, are continuing to find it difficult to discover healthy export markets as the global economy struggles and the competition is intense. So there is no sign of export-led recovery on the basis of the data that I'm looking at. So whatever happens on the exchange rate front, even if we do get some depreciation, domestic policy action is required. The domestic economy has to contribute towards the recovery. But I do not doubt that policymakers in the UK, George Osborne and his ilk, face a complex balancing act in determining how speedily to get back to normal deficit levels en route to sustainable debt levels. There's no absolute right answer to this. But we know that if they're seen as moving too slowly, then the markets will show their disappointment and mark up long-term interest rates, which will exert a drag effect throughout the economy. If they move too fast, then they risk dampening such demand as does exist, both directly via lower net public expenditure and indirectly via the effect of that reduction on households and businesses through tax hikes, cuts in public expenditure, and cuts in public sector employment. Now, we've already seen from what I've said earlier that household demand and private investment are constrained because they're getting debt back to acceptable levels, and I've suggested that an export-led recovery remains a hope rather than a fact or even a realistic expectation. So if we added to that too rapid, too dramatic a cutback in demand from the public sector, then the prospects of any early recovery would be minimal. We've got to get this right. It's also not just a matter of how fast you cut the deficit, but how you do it, how you can get the balance of tax cuts, tax increases and public expenditure cuts so as to limit the impact on demand, and also to look to the longer term. Because post-recession, we're going to need all the skills we can. We're going to need infrastructure. And we have to maintain our capability for competitiveness while going through this squeeze on the public finances. It's one heck of a job, and I don't envy the Chancellor or his successors. So we've got to look, though, to some recovery in household demand, some recovery in business investment, some support for exports, and not too big a dampener from the public sector. So we don't know when we're going to emerge from recession. Perhaps we'll get a pickup in the third quarter. The last 2 quarters have been negative, so we are formally in recession. Perhaps Q3 will be positive due to an Olympic effect. But if so, will it be sustained, or is that just a one-quarter wonder? I always get worried when I hear Conservative politicians from former eras talking about green shoots, as John Major did recently. I think he was just busy promoting a book, really. But I worry about green shoots. I would much prefer to see a fully flourishing plant before I was of the view that this recovery is underway. So I'm convinced that we need some flexibility on the fiscal front, some measures to instill confidence and encourage a gentle pickup in demand. What we don't need is something that is heavy-footed and intransigent in the way fiscal policy is managed. And I'm glad we've got the Office of Budget Responsibility. I'm glad that Mr. Robert Choate is there and his colleagues, because this is an arm's length view. And I'm glad that they'll be looking at what's happening on cyclical compared to structural deficits. And I hope we can then see a government and a chancellor with the economic and political skills to manage the economic policy balancing trick. But let me carry on with the post-recession period now. What happens after that? And there are various reasons I would suggest why the economy post-recession would differ markedly from that which we became accustomed in the nice era. We're not going back to those times. For a start, policymakers, as well as households and businesses, will be ultra cautious so far as debt levels are concerned. They've been bitten, they are shy. There'll be built-in resistance to structural deficits exceeding very specifically stated levels, and severe constraints on all debt to GDP ratios, and households and banks will all be far more cautious. They'll work to continue to reduce their debt levels. Remember from this chart that's still up there how far they've got to go, so they'll continue to be cautious. I hope businesses will start to borrow more and invest more, but the demand for credit from business remains low, and banks will only wish to lend to the most efficient of businesses, with clear views as to where market growth can be expected and how companies can achieve enhanced competitiveness in those areas. I think it is a question of demand for credit as much as supply of credit that is the problem so far as businesses are concerned. I must praise Scottish Enterprise for the emphasis they've placed on high-growth firms, because I think this shows one way forward of picking on proven winners and trying to encourage them to develop and encouraging others to enter that high-growth field. So there's going to be ultra caution from government, from households and from businesses. There's also going to be an issue that the trend growth rate will be revisited. Now, the trend growth rate is the level that the economy is assumed to grow or be able to grow on a continuing basis without undue stresses and strains emerging. It's in large part related to how fast you think productivity is improving. Now, trend growth in the nice days was marked up to maybe 2.5% or even 3%, and policy was adjusted to allow for that rate of growth, to encourage that rate of growth. Post-recession, I think we'll be lucky if they think trend growth is 1.5%. And monetary and fiscal policy will therefore tend to be much tighter, other things remaining equal, than before the recession, and there's no risk of irrational exuberance breaking out again. So far as policymakers are concerned, it will be the time for the natural pessimists to rule the roost, and 1.5% will be good enough, and policy won't allow going much faster than that. And it will also be assumed that this lower trend growth rate applied during the recessionary period from 2008 to now and beyond. And that will imply that the extent of catch-up to get back to where we should have been will be significantly less than if we applied a trend growth rate of 2.5% or 3%. So we'll recover to a lower base, and policy will be aimed at our growing much more slowly thereafter. Very different times in the expected pace of growth. And one implication of all of this, and I'll come back to this at times, is for the public finances. Now, the first years of the Scottish Parliament were characterised by annual growth rates in the funds available, rapid annual growth rates. Those days have passed, and we shouldn't expect them to come back in the near future. And even when the UK or independent Scottish economy is set on a stable recovery path, there will still be constraints. I hosted Bob Black, the former Auditor General at the David Hume Institute last week, and he emphasised the necessity for tough decisions on public finances will continue for the foreseeable future. What he said was, whether the outcome is more devolution or complete independence, we will be facing the same challenges in our public services as we do today. The next challenge for the future I want to touch on is demographics. Now, I probably don't need to remind actuaries in the audience of the fact of the changes that are underway, and those dealing with the pension funds and the like have long been aware that life expectancy is steadily increasing. Indeed, when I was chairing the BBC Pension Trust, at one stage I thought I'd discovered that the life expectancy for people in my age group was growing faster than I was aging. Now, I thought this was a sort of Doctor Who moment. It was wonderful. It didn't endure, but there we go. So when we accompany the massive increase in male and female longevity with the reducing birth rate, the end product is a rapid increase in the share of the population beyond normal working age. So you can just see these projections of the change in the share of the population since 1971 up to about 1930 by age group. You can see that the total population, the share of the total population accounted for by my lot, the 65 plus, is expected to increase by 6 percentage points, while the shares of all those in the 2060 to 64 age group falls away, and that of 0 to 19 plummet. Now, these are UK data, but Treasury data I saw last week showed that it's, if anything, even worse in Scotland. The ratio of those aged 65 plus to those in the standard working age group of 16 to 65 will be some 4 percentage points higher in Scotland by the 2030s than for the UK as a whole. And the impact of this demographic change on the economy and on the public finances will be of substance. Now, maybe we can offset some of that by immigration, but it will be difficult for Scotland to have a different migration policy from the rest of the UK, while part of the UK. As Robert Wright from Strathclyde University is quoted as saying in the Herald just last week, there's a difference in political view about migration north and south of the border, and while the coalition government is less keen on any increase in numbers than our administration might be, it's going to be slightly difficult for an increase to take place of any scale. And also I would argue that if you have immigration of young people for a limited period, that may just delay the demographic time bomb rather than actually diffusing it. So just show you another chart on the demographics, my last chart for today. There can be also mitigation of the impact via changes in working age and pension age, and that's taking place, and that will have to continue to take place. But it's not easy, and the stresses that change provokes are clear to us all. And we'll also face rising costs for the public finances. And Sir Harry Burns will no doubt have said to you last year that the increase in the older age group is not necessarily an indication of an increase in healthy retirement years. It's sadly an increase in unhealthy retirement years with all the costs that involves. So massive increase in costs for the elderly, a reduced number of people in working age paying taxes. It's a very nasty, toxic cocktail to add on to the problems I've already described. So the public finances will be constrained post-recession because there'll be a necessity to further reduce debt and contain deficits, because actual and trend GDP growth will be slower, and because of the marked impact of demographic change. I mean, that's not all. There's just one more factor of substance to introduce, which is dealing with climate change and the broader environmental challenge. And there's no chance for a full discussion here. I'll just mention that I don't see how we can base our expectations of lowering significantly greenhouse gas emissions in energy generation, transport, housing, infrastructure general. How can we expect to do that without significant financial costs being involved? Sure, we can have technological change that reduce the extent of those costs, but there will be significant financial costs. And they will fall on some combination of households, businesses, and the public finances. If the costs fall on the public finances, that's another direct hit on those finances, another addition to the squeeze. If they fall on households and businesses, then they'll result in slower growth and indirectly put more pressure on the public finances. I could also add that Scotland remains a highly unequal society, and future governments may decide that the public will is there to work to reduce inequalities. And that would mean a rebalancing of priorities away from growth towards equity, particularly if it's felt that during this extended recessionary period we've been through, that the inequalities have been extended and have caused more angst. That again will cause squeeze. I'd also like to see more expenditure on some policies which will bring great benefits in equity and efficiency in later time, like early years investment, which I think is a critical requirement. But it's going to be very difficult to persuade any government to put substantial resources into policies which will take 10 or more years to begin to pay off at a time when the public finances are so squeezed. It's difficult. Now I'm drawing towards some conclusions. Now I've always believed in the old adage that there are two types of economists, those who don't know and those who don't know that they don't know. Now I always try to beware falling into that latter category. So let me try to be careful. I don't know when we'll leave recession. I don't know with any degree of certainty what our economy will look like post-recession. But I do hope that I've begun to identify some of the factors that will lead to it being very different from the nice decade and previous eras. So what do I think about life in the next decade? I think we're going to have a continuation of low interest rates. I don't see any inflation challenge, and I do foresee tight fiscal policy. And tight fiscal policy can be accompanied by continuing loose monetary policy, i.e. low rates. I don't see the Monetary Policy Committee moving to increase interest rates or reversing quantitative easing in anything but a very slow and cautious manner, even when growth is reinstalled. I think base rates should stay right where it is for some time, and that the new norm for the base rate and for bond yields is likely to be well below the old. I don't see any boom years in prospect for the equity markets. Global growth is not going to go back to past peaks, and even China now is beginning to struggle. This is difficult times globally as well as domestically. Corporate profitability will be constrained, equity markets will be subdued. The combination of relatively low return on assets and a low discount rate for your liabilities will place continuing pressures on pension funds. I'm glad I'm not a chair of a pension trust anymore. Likewise, the housing market is not going to recover to its old norm. We may recover some lost ground gently, but we're not going back to anything like year-on-year double-digit increases. So household wealth will disappoint. I thought income growth will be subdued in the low inflation environment, and given the tight story I'm talking about in household wealth is not getting back to where it was. We'll see the times when people leave the working age and start pensions steadily drifting upwards. It's both because of the pressure on the public finances and also because individuals will face much more limited pension pots than prior generations and won't have accumulated housing wealth. No windfall gains for them from the housing market. But most of all, I think we're going to face this decades of tough decision-making on the public finances, decades of tough decision-making. And we do need to work towards a rational, transparent, and informed approach to decision-making on all public finance matters. And that applies if we're in an independent Scotland or one subject to further fiscal devolution or something more akin to the status quo. There's no escape from the tough times, and there's no escape from the need for tough choices. And constitutional change will reduce neither the immediate financial pressure nor the need for rational, transparent, and informed decision-making going forward. Now, I know this is contentious ground, and I'm deliberately trying to avoid any political slant to what I say. But I would like to cite, therefore, a recent submission to the Finance Committee at Holyrood by the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which I was party to, but is not my responsibility. Some of the comments and proposals we came up with were as follows. We stress the need for a strategic approach to be taken to ensure that spending decisions support the Scottish Government's key objective of achieving sustainable economic growth. That's got to be at the core of what you're doing the whole time. We called for a treasury function. There is none really in Scotland at the moment, which would be created within the Scottish Government and tasked with undertaking full cost benefit analysis and opportunity cost assessment of all policy options. And if there was some question about public exposure of that analysis, then we suggested that an independent body akin in status to the Office of Budget Responsibility at UK level should be set up as a vehicle through which these discussions can take place, believing that that would greatly enhance public debate and understanding of the realities and implications of budget cuts, and be able to answer the numerous questions put forward in the public arena, such as what the protection of funding for some flagship projects means for the funding of other areas. We also saw such measures and informed input from the likes of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which we need to be as rigorous and vigorous in Scotland as it is at the UK level. We thought that that would actually place the Finance Committee at Holyrood in a much stronger position to fulfil its remit of examining the government's spending plans and also generally facilitate more informed, high-quality debate on draft budgets by MSPs. Now, in his speech last week, Bob Black called for a standing commission on resources and performance, independent from government and informing Parliament, and also for a safe place in which policy can be discussed without the limitations imposed by party politics. And there's a great deal of consistency between what Bob's saying and what that RSE submission is saying. The latter was framed in the context of the 2013-14 budget, But I would argue that given the expectation of public finance pressure going forward, I would argue that both the RSE suggestions and Bob Black's are most distinctly pertinent in the longer-term context and merit serious attention. Now, I believe fundamentally in transparency. I don't believe in hiding in smoke-filled rooms. I believe in evidence-based policymaking. And I believe that in these challenging years that are ahead of us, transparency and evidence and analysis-based policy making and decision-making on public policies and the public finances arising from that work will be ever more critical. We must know where we wish to head. We must make the best fist we can in moving in that agreed direction in these difficult times. Post-recession life will not be easy for anyone in the private sector or the public sector, but more open discussion of the issues can help, and we can move to the best world that is feasible under these circumstances. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jeremy, for that stimulating, slightly depressing, but I think very realistic view of the profoundly different economic climate post-recession, whenever we'll be able to use that word post-recession. It's now time for questions. The questions will be videoed. It's just as a warning, in case anyone who wants to ask a question is camera shy. And if you could wait to receive a microphone so we can make sure that we hear clearly your question. So can I throw it to the audience, please? It's always a difficult bit, asking the first one. Please.
Thank you, Stuart Ritchie. First of all, thank you very much for that. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was
you weren't
really
meant to enjoy it.
It's an actory.
The Eurozone crisis, how do you think it's likely to play out, and how do you think that will influence your prognosis for the UK and Scottish economies, depending on exactly how the Eurozone crisis plays out?
Thank you. It's always good to start with the easy question. I think that the real dramatic problem on the Eurozone crisis is Greece. I think that Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and even probably Italy can work their way through. They will go through even tougher times than we go through, but they can make it to the end. I think Greece is so dissimilar from the other economies that I think there will be real difficulties in retaining Greece in the Eurozone because the traumas that they would have to go through, we already see they're severe, we're already seeing they're leading to civil strife. I think it may be not possible. What Greece needs is a good, substantial devaluation. It can't do that while it remains in. I don't see any way that it could be achieved. So I think that the way I see policies developing, the effort is being made to secure the future of the zone for the other countries I've referred to and get to a position where there is confidence that the zone will survive with the core plus some of the peripheral members, and then permit Greece to gracefully exit, but not to go now at a time when it could lead to a view that the others would follow. So I think the efforts that have been made by the European Central Bank with a degree of support from Germany now, which is absolutely critical, will lead to that conclusion. Frankly, the only other option I can see is Germany popping out the top. Is Germany moving out and restoring the Deutschmark on a much stronger basis than the euro, because it is so out of kilter with a number of countries. And I do remember when I used to visit Germany that the Germans said not all Germans believe in God, but all Germans believe in the Bundesbank. a lot of them would like the Bundesbank back. I don't think that will happen. I think politically that's not going to happen. But I think Greece, I can't see Greece staying and that being consistent with getting through this crisis.
Thank you. Please, in the front here.
Paul Shelley, you talked about how important it was for measures to instil confidence, and I wondered where you would start with instilling confidence.
That's a very good question, it really is, because I think confidence is utterly critical. I think what I might do is make a 1-year reduction in VAT, get people to believe that there were ways in which taxes could go down as well as up, try to encourage people not to spend excessively, not to get their debt levels back up, but just to be a little bit more comfortable and a little bit of easing. I might do that as just and indicate that it is a one-off, but indicate that that is expected to instill a pickup in demand, which can then help kickstart the economy. Something's got to kickstart it, and I don't know what else does it. Business investment isn't going to do it. Exports aren't going to do it. I think the consumer has to come through at some stage. And just something that gives consumers a little bit more hope, maybe about all that can be achieved. But confidence is critical. And I think we do face problems because of the way in which the government has operated has not always let them be seen as wholly efficient over the last period. And I don't think that helps very much either. Not the best answer. There's no easy answer to your question.
Thank you. On this side.
Robert Clarkson. As a Scottish actuary, our motto used to be ad finem fidelis, which I would translate as faithful to the long-term goal. One thing that you said, I'm afraid I agree with, the trend economic growth rate might be nearer 1.5%. I have my doubts there. I'd be interested in passing if you have any comments on our education status in UK. You'll know the comments we've made by the CBI. And compared to what I've seen in developing countries, Singapore, China, Korea, I think we are slipping seriously. But to kickstart, confidence is a fragile thing. If you go back to 1985, a Conservative Chancellor took away life assurance premium relief. At the moment, if you invest in venture capital trusts, you can get 30% tax relief. These are very specialist vehicles. Might there not be a case for thinking of some radical way of encouraging long-term savings from the population into something other than gilts, which pension funds are forced into by the stupid accounting rules, or the housing stock, which I agree has perhaps been a little unfortunate in past decades?
It's very difficult to know where to invest at the moment, isn't it? It's a real problem. Where is your secure, low-risk, decent return asset? It ain't there anymore, is it? And encouraging people into slightly higher risk areas may be the right answer, but a lot of them, the risk is quite serious. Now, I think I approve of the government policy to introduce pensions across the piece in the private sector. I think this present move is something that makes sense, because I think individuals need to be given the right encouragement to build up their pension pots. I'm not sure on life insurance relief. I'll leave others who know better than I do. But I think that we need to encourage a reasonable degree of saving across the population. One of the problems with the debt and wealth balances that we used to look at was the debt tended to be in one pocket of the economy and the wealth in another. So if you did debt to wealth calculations for the whole economy, it looked okay. But if you broke it down to who had the debt and who had the wealth, you realized that that wasn't the case. On education, where are we? Well, in Scotland, we've got an extremely well-funded higher education system at the moment. But we've got a paucity of funding for further education, in my view. And a lot of that is being used to deal with the promise to give an opportunity to all not in employment, education and training. And that's a very reasonable promise to give. But it does mean that the further education sector, which should be dealing in a lot of the mid-level skills, is being squeezed. And I think that our graduate level turnout is not bad. But I think we face the dual problems of a very high percentage of the population who don't go anywhere, which is why I want the investment in early years, and lack of emphasis on the craft skills, the middle level skills. I think we also face a problem that employers don't make use of people with those skills. I've looked at some comparisons with other economies, and people who turn out with further education skills in Scotland, and I think applies in the rest of the UK, tend to go into a little box and be left in that box. In other countries, in Scandinavia and Germany, they're put into a job and allowed to grow, and they're encouraged to grow. I think we have to not only develop the right FE school education, but also nurture that people and expect them to develop and encourage folk to develop. So I put more money into early years. I try to get rid of the 15% of the population that don't contribute for terrible reasons of different types. I'd relook at the HEFE balance a little bit, and I'd also encourage employers to do everything they can to make the most of the talent, and not to treat a barman as a barman forever, but someone who has the potential to be the manager in a year's time.
Candia Kingston. As a current pension trustee, we spend a lot of our time arguing about equity risk premiums. And I was wondering, if you were still to be a pension trustee, what level of equity risk premium would you be arguing for and why?
Oh dear. Oh dear. I think the time has come to actually dip toes further into the equity pond. I think that it's necessary now, and I think the risks, the catastrophic risk has tended to dissipate. I think we're talking about a time when well-based, safe equities should be a higher percentage of portfolios going forward than was the case in the past difficult years. So I think pension funds have to move in that direction. And I'd rather they moved in that direction than in some of the alternative investment opportunities which kept coming our way, which I didn't see as ones that I was particularly tempted by, because when you got down to them, the risk was much more significant than within equities a lot of the time. So, yeah, I think you've got to get back into equities more, but cautiously. There are good performing equities out there, and certainly don't look at ones that have most of their earnings in Greece. So, gentleman here.
Hello, my name is Gordon Baggett. I'm interested in where pension fund money or investments might go, and we're kind of dodged what advice and guidance might be given to the thousands and eventually millions who will be setting up and funding their nest pension pots. If there's one thing that's missing from all of this, is some sort of guidance. I'm not saying advice, but guidance as to what some of these younger people should be doing into the future. Much of what is happening just now is quite missing from that information that you should be having.
Well, I think that there's a great deal missing in financial education generally, and I think that's something that there should be more emphasis on financial education for young people throughout schools than is the case. Then I agree with you that advice. Mind you, I don't think my daughters would say that necessarily the advice I gave them on pensions 20 years ago when they started on their careers was of the best. In fact, one of my daughters constantly reminds me of what I said about pensions at that time. But I do think what people need is to understand better, not just to get parrot advice, but to get the context and to be able to think through for themselves. And I think it's terribly important. I mean, people starting off on their careers now have got a heck of a time ahead of them, a heck of a time. And I think they just, it's very, very difficult, and I think they have to have the best possible financial advice. And then accept that it's going to be a tough road for the next decade at least. But they have to know that, and they have to work on that expectation. It's not very nice, is it?
Hi, Philip Brunner. Nice to see you again, Jeremy. I believe the last Ernst & Young report that came out in 2011 specified that there's a £370 billion shortfall in the infrastructure investment needed to meet the requirements of the UK National Infrastructure Plan by 2025. Do you have any idea about how we might, in a policy sense, encourage that scale of investment to be unlocked? And might the Green Investment Bank have a role to play there?
Oh dear. I think the infrastructure story is a very sad one at the moment. I mean, in Scotland, I think there were, in the 2012-13 budget, there was a statement that, what was it, 250 million was being transferred from current expenditure to capital expenditure. No one knows what's happened to that. There's no trace on it. There's no sign of it. And how's the Forth Bridge actually going to be funded? Do you understand how the Scottish Futures Trust works its way through this? I find it very difficult. I mean, I actually believed in the PFI for a long time, and I still do believe that if you get the right risk transfer and the right arrangements, that I believe the benefits from particularly the operating phase can be such as to lead to it being a much more efficient way of delivering projects. But so much has gone wrong in PFI PPP that it's going to be difficult to see that route progressed. It's going to be very difficult for governments, Scottish or UK, to actually cut back on current expenditure in order to finance capital expenditure at this time. But that's what they have to do. They have to do that for skills, for education, just as they have to do it for infrastructure. We have to have that continuation of infrastructure development and skills development to have any chance of being competitive globally as we go forward. But in tough times, companies cut their training budgets, governments cut their infrastructure budgets, and that's the easy solution. And it's the wrong solution. Now, are there ways in which pension funds can be used for this infrastructure availability? What is it, a year ago that George Osborne went on a consultation on this, and we hosted a seminar up at the Mound to talk about it. But nothing ever emerged. Are there ways in which pension funds could be deployed to the low-risk end of infrastructure activities in a way that would actually permit more infrastructure development to take place at a time of scarce public finances? I think that maybe. I think that's the type of alternative investment vehicle that properly developed might make some sense. Not at the risk stage, but at the subsequent stage. So I think we've got to be innovative. I think we've got to persuade government that they've got to look long-term, as someone else was just saying. We mustn't look short-term and be myopic. We've got to look long-term, but that's tough, because that means squeezing at the short-term. Voters tend to think short-term, particularly in tough times. But we have to get the infrastructure right. So there's some ideas there, what one could do.
Could I just come in with a question on quantitative easing and ask your views as the effectiveness of quantitative easing in the UK as a monetary tool? Because I struggle to understand it. I can understand, if you keep short rates down in our economy, then that should help stimulate a number of things. I struggle with understanding the combination of effects that you get by artificially depressing the long end.
I actually sometimes wonder whether quantitative easing is fiscal loosening undertaken by the Bank of England because the Treasury can't do it, and whether it's just pumping liquidity into the system. But where it actually goes, I mean, the Bank of England have carried out they've stylized exercises where they've compared a counterfactual of what would have happened with what's happened and showed that it has led to growth being quarter of a percent per annum better than it would have been without, that there has been some positive impact. But I don't think it's leading to banks being in a much better position to lend. I don't think it changes the interest rate at which you're prepared to lend to businesses significantly. I don't see how it's feeding through to the economy, to be quite honest. It's doing some in some widespread manner, through the ether it gets there, without anyone actually knowing how it works. Other people have actually suggested is there some way in which quantitative easing could be used to direct funds towards infrastructure? Are there ways in which it could be channeled to particular activities rather than just generally pervasively through? But it is a form of fiscal loosening. I asked someone from the Bank of England the other day about, how come QE was going on when wasn't it contradictory to fiscal loosening? And I didn't actually get an answer, so that maybe it was a stupid question, or maybe he didn't want to answer, I don't know. But I'm glad they've done it, because I think we would be worse off without it. But I'm not sure it has been done in a way that has maximised the benefit from the sum of funds that are involved.
Thank you.
David Martin is my name. My question touches on the answer before the last one. I realise you don't want to be political, but there is a big debate in Scotland at the moment about the funding of benefits, particularly free benefits, and the question as to whether that can continue or not. Is it your view that the need for infrastructure costs could be met by a reduction in the benefits, which is clearly a highly political point in Scotland at present?
I think it is absolutely my view that there should be no totems which are not discussed and considered as policy options within the climate we now find ourselves. I think it is absolutely right that one should look at the costs of free prescriptions of bus passes, I carry mine proudly around, and actually look at what the opportunity costs are of what isn't funded as a result of those activities and what the benefits are in the context of the objective of enhancing sustainable growth from those expenditures. I think one needs to be open and transparent in considering whether there are options to some of the universal benefits and to the council tax freeze, for example, whether there are options there which merit consideration in order to transfer funds into early years, into infrastructure, into other areas. I think that should be an open and transparent debate, and one should not immediately shout that we can't look at that. I think they need to be looked at, and they need to be looked at objectively and rigorously. And I think that is something that would be helped by having a Treasury function within the office, having an OBR function, having the IFS engaged to look rigorously and properly. One needs government examination, one needs an arm's length organisation working with government, and one needs good, rigorous and well-resourced think tank type bodies to actually cast light on these issues. One doesn't want to immediately slam the door and say you can't think of that.
We've got time for about one more question. Yes, please, thank you.
Thanks very much. David Clark's the name. You were quite emphatic about there being a low inflationary environment, and in some ways it's an unfair question to look for evidence of something not happening, but what evidence do you have to have such strong belief that we won't have inflation going forward?
I think that inflation can come from either domestic or external sources. I think the world we're in at the moment, if you look externally, has this great movement of production capacity being enhanced in China and India and Brazil and Vietnam and wherever you look, and that we have a decade or two ahead of us of low-cost production of a number of commodities and goods that can be imported. Sorry, I shouldn't have said commodity, of goods that can be imported. I don't think we're heading for another oil crisis unless the Middle East explodes, in which case problems, but the costs of shale gas are ridiculously low, and there are other means. There's plenty of coal throughout China. I'm told they just opened 8 big deep mines in one particular area. There's plenty of coal, there's plenty of shale gas, and I believe that the oil price probably went too high. So I don't think energy prices are going to explode. I don't think manufactured good prices are going to explode, and increasingly traded services are going to be spread across the globe to these lower cost, increasingly efficient locations. So I don't think we'll get imported inflation. Domestically, I think we've all been scared stiff by what's happened. And we've now in our 3rd or 4th year of a reduction in real incomes. Now that's tough times. But I don't see us moving suddenly to 5% real income increases in the private or public sector in the period ahead. People will be much more worried about how to sort the pensions out, how to deal. I think there's so much more that is going to keep a cap on incomes. So if you're not getting it imported, you're not getting incomes growing significantly above the low inflation environment we're in now. I don't see where the inflationary pressures come from. So that's why I think for the next several years, those factors will lead to inflation remaining at or around 2%.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to now just draw things to a conclusion, and firstly saying thank you very much for the audience joining us this evening. Immediately after this, there will be some drinks in the Tub Cafe, which I believe is just down there somewhere. I'm sure there'll be people to guide us there. Can I, in trying to commend some thanks to Jeremy, just really, I think, draw out 2 or 3 key points. I think the phrase you used, profoundly different economic climate post-recession, is words that certainly have ringed in my ears this evening. I think your arguments that debt will be at significantly lower levels, GDP growth, trend growth down, demographic changes and climate changes, each adding to the pressures. Very clear messages, and thank you for that. I think that your conclusion that rates and inflation will be low for longer is one that feels correct, but quite how long and how low, I think, is the real challenge for us. And those are very important parameters for the work that we do as actuaries. So, Jeremy, thank you very much indeed. It's been a stimulating evening. And can I ask you all to show your appreciation in the normal way? Thank you. Thank you very much.